The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew it was trouble before I even opened it because the Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association only sent certified mail when they wanted to make your life miserable. I stood in my driveway, still holding the propane tank I had just loaded out of my truck, and ripped open the envelope. The letter was 2 pages of dense text, but the relevant part jumped out at me immediately. I was being fined $500 for unauthorized commercial activity because I had been refilling propane tanks on my property, not selling them, not running a business. Just refilling the tanks I used for my backup generator, my grill, and the emergency heating system I had installed in my workshop. My name is Ethan Donovan, and I had lived in Pleasant Valley Estates outside of Charlotte, North Carolina for 3 years. I worked as an electrical engineer for a tech company downtown, and I had specifically chosen this property because it had a large workshop where I could pursue my hobby of building and maintaining backup power systems. The neighborhood was nice enough, with well-maintained homes and decent neighbors, but the HOA was run by a woman named Patricia Zimmer who treated the community rules like they were handed down from Mount Sinai. I walked into my house and called the HOA office immediately. A receptionist answered, her voice professionally neutral. "This is Ethan Donovan at 447 Maple Ridge Drive. I just received a fine notice and I need to speak with someone about it." "Mr. Donovan, yes. Mrs. Zimmer left a note that you might call. She is available at 4 o'clock this afternoon if you would like to schedule a meeting." I glanced at my watch. It was 2:15. "Fine. I'll be there at 4. The HOA office was located in the community center, a building that also housed a small gym and a meeting room that was rented out for events. I arrived 5 minutes early and found Patricia Zimmer waiting in her office, a space decorated with motivational posters about community and responsibility. She was in her late 40s, with short blonde hair styled in what I called the speak to the manager cut, and she wore a blazer that looked too formal for a Tuesday afternoon in a suburban HOA office. "Mr. Donovan, please sit down." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "I assume you received our notice about the violations." "I did, and I want to understand what I'm supposedly violating. I refill propane tanks for my own use. That's not commercial activity." Patricia folded her hands on her desk and gave me a tight smile. "According to Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants, residents are not permitted to store or maintain hazardous materials in quantities exceeding normal household use. You have been observed with multiple propane tanks, and neighbors have reported seeing you refilling them on a regular basis." "I have 4 tanks," I said, keeping my voice level. "1 for my grill, 1 for my backup generator, and 2 for my workshop heating system. That is normal household use. I refill them myself because it's cheaper and more convenient than doing exchanges." "The covenant does not make exceptions based on convenience, Mr. Donovan. The board has determined that your activities constitute a violation." I leaned forward. "Who complained? I'm not at liberty to share that information." "Of course you're not." I sat back and considered my options. "Fine. I'll stop refilling the tanks, but I want it on record that I disagree with this interpretation of the covenants." Patricia's expression remained unchanged. "Your objection will be noted. The fine still stands and you have 30 days to pay." I left the office fuming. $500 for doing something completely reasonable on my own property. But I was a practical person, and I knew that fighting an HOA was often more trouble than it was worth. I would pay the fine, stop refilling the tanks, and find another solution. What I didn't know at the time was that my propane refills had been serving a purpose beyond my own needs. It was 3 weeks later when I first heard about the problem. My neighbor across the street, Marcus Chen, knocked on my door one evening while I was grilling dinner. "Ethan, hey. Do you know anything about the backup generators at the community center?" I flipped a burger and shook my head. "No, why? They're not working. There was a power outage this afternoon during that storm and the generators didn't kick on. The whole building was dark for 4 hours. Patricia is freaking out because there's a wedding reception scheduled there this weekend." I felt a small twinge of something, not quite satisfaction, but close. I didn't even know the community center had backup generators. Yeah, apparently they were installed a few years ago. Some kind of propane system. I just thought you might know something about it since you're into all that electrical stuff. I certainly was into electrical stuff, but I had no involvement with the community center's systems. Or so I thought. The next day, I received another phone call from the HOA office. This time it was Patricia herself. "Mr. Donovan, I need to ask you about your propane activities." I took a deep breath. "I stopped refilling tanks 3 weeks ago, just like you demanded. I'm in compliance with your interpretation of the covenants." There was a pause. "Yes, well, we've discovered a situation. The community center's backup generator system has failed, and our maintenance contractor believes it may be related to propane supply issues. I understand you have expertise in this area. I'm an electrical engineer, not an HVAC technician. But what does this have to do with me?" Another pause, longer this time. "It has come to our attention that the previous property manager, before my time, had arranged for you to provide propane refills for the community center's backup systems. We found some old invoices in the files." I felt my jaw drop. "Excuse me. I never agreed to provide propane for the community center. The invoices show payments to you for propane services dating back 2.5 years. I sat down heavily in my desk chair. "Patricia, I have never received a single payment from the HOA for propane or any other service. I don't know what invoices you're looking at, but they're wrong. I'm looking at them right now. They show monthly payments of $200 to Ethan Donovan for propane refill services." My mind raced. When did these payments supposedly start? 29 months ago. I pulled up my banking records on my computer and started scrolling back. I'm looking at my bank records right now. I see my regular paycheck deposits, some freelance work payments, but nothing from the HOA, not a single payment. That's impossible. The checks were cut and cashed. Then someone else cashed them because it wasn't me. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Patricia said, "I need to look into this. But in the meantime, we have a serious problem. The community center has no functioning backup power and we have events scheduled. The maintenance contractor says the propane system was regularly serviced, but now the tanks are empty and the refill equipment is malfunctioning." "What refill equipment?" "Apparently there's a propane refill station in the maintenance room behind the community center. The contractor says it hasn't been maintained properly." A picture was starting to form in my mind and I didn't like it. "Patricia, I need to see this setup. Can I come over right now?" I suppose that would be acceptable. I grabbed my keys and drove to the community center. Patricia met me at the back entrance, looking considerably less composed than she had in our previous meeting. She led me through a maintenance corridor to a room I had never seen before. Inside was a propane refill station, a professional-grade setup with a bulk storage tank, transfer pumps, and multiple connection points for portable tanks. I walked around the equipment, examining it carefully. The bulk storage tank was indeed empty. The transfer pump had a broken seal. And there was a maintenance log hanging on a clipboard nearby. I flipped through the log. The entries were regular, dated every 2 weeks and signed with my name. I didn't write any of these entries, I said. This isn't my signature. Patricia looked pale. Mr. Donovan, I'm beginning to believe you. But this creates a very serious problem. If you weren't maintaining this system, who was? Someone who was forging invoices and stealing from the HOA, I said. And apparently forging my signature too. We spent the next hour going through records. Patricia pulled up the HOA's financial files and showed me the invoices. They were professionally formatted, with my name and address at the top, and they detailed propane refill services for the community center's backup systems. Each invoice was for $200 and they had been paid monthly like clockwork. The checks were made out to you, Patricia said, pointing at the screen, and they were all cashed within a few days of being issued. But not by me. Can you see where they were cashed? Patricia clicked through several screens. They were all deposited at a branch of First National Bank in Concord. I banked with a different institution entirely. I've never even been to that branch. This is identity theft. Patricia sat back in her chair. I need to call the police. The police took the situation seriously, once they understood the scope. Detective Sarah Morrison from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department arrived at the community center and spent 2 hours reviewing the evidence. She was thorough and professional, taking copies of all the invoices, the maintenance logs, and the bank records. Mr. Donovan, I'm going to need you to file a formal identity theft report, she said. And we'll need to contact the bank to get information about the account where these checks were deposited. Mrs. Zimmer, I'll also need access to any security footage you might have of the maintenance area. We have cameras at the main entrances, but not in the maintenance corridor, Patricia said. Budget constraints. Detective Morrison nodded. We'll work with what we have. In the meantime, I'd advise both of you not to touch anything else in that maintenance room. It's potentially part of a crime scene. The investigation moved quickly once the bank got involved. Within a week, Detective Morrison called me with an update. We've identified the person who opened the account and deposited the checks. It's a woman named Linda Kozlowski. Does that name mean anything to you? I searched my memory. No, I don't think I know anyone by that name. She was the property manager for Pleasant Valley Estates HOA from 3 years ago until about 8 months ago. According to Mrs. Zimmer, she was let go for performance issues. Everything clicked into place. She was stealing from the HOA and using my name to cover it up. That's what it looks like. She had access to the check writing system, so she could create invoices and issue checks to herself. By using your name and forging your signature, she made it look like a legitimate service contract. But why use my name specifically, Mrs. Zimmer mentioned that you had talked to the HOA about your backup power systems when you first moved in. You had asked if there were any restrictions on installing a generator. Miss Kozlowski was the property manager at the time, so she knew you had expertise in this area. It made you a convenient cover for her fraud. I felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger at being used as a pawn in someone's theft scheme, and relief that I could prove I had nothing to do with it. What happens now? We've obtained a warrant for her arrest. She'll be charged with theft, fraud, forgery, and identity theft. The district attorney will handle the prosecution. Linda Kozlowski was arrested 2 days later. The local news covered the story because the amount she had stolen totaled nearly $50,000 when you included other fraudulent invoices she had created over her tenure as property manager. The propane services billed under my name accounted for about $7,000 of that total. But the immediate problem remained. The community center had no functioning backup power, and Patricia Zimmer was facing increasing pressure from residents who had booked events there. She called me 4 days after Linda's arrest. Mr. Donovan, I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies, actually. For the fine, for the accusations, and for not catching this fraud sooner. I appreciate that, I said. I assume you'll be canceling the fine, already done. And I've recommended to the board that we reimburse you for any legal fees or expenses you incurred during this investigation. That's fair. What about the backup power situation? Patricia sighed. That's why I'm calling. I've had 3 contractors come out to assess the system, and they all say the same thing. The equipment was neglected for so long that it needs to be completely replaced. We're looking at a cost of $60,000 minimum, and it will take 6 weeks to install. That seems high. The propane bulk storage tank has corrosion damage. The transfer pump needs to be replaced. The generator itself has mechanical issues from running on poorly maintained fuel, and the electrical connections don't meet current code requirements. It's a mess. I thought about it. Despite everything that had happened, I felt some responsibility to help. These were my neighbors, even if the HOA leadership had been problematic. I might have a temporary solution, I said, but I'd need the board's approval for some changes. Patricia perked up. What kind of changes? I have my own backup generator system that I use for my workshop. It's a portable setup, but it's powerful enough to handle essential loads for the community center. I could set it up temporarily while you work on a permanent repair, but I'd need to bring propane tanks on site and refill them regularly. There was a long pause. Then Patricia said, Mr. Donovan, given what we just put you through, I would completely understand if you told us to handle this ourselves. Honestly, I considered it, but I'm not going to let wedding receptions and community events get canceled because of Linda Kozlowski's crimes. How soon do you need the power operational? There's a wedding this Saturday. That's 4 days from now. I winced. That's tight, but I can probably do it. I'll need help moving equipment, and the HOA will have to agree in writing that I'm exempt from any covenants related to propane storage or refilling while I'm providing this service. I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. I enlisted Marcus Chen and 2 other neighbors to help me move my portable generator setup to the community center. The generator was an industrial-grade unit mounted on a wheeled frame, capable of producing 15 kilowatts of continuous power. I had built the system myself over the course of a year, using salvaged components and careful engineering to create something reliable and efficient. We set it up in the maintenance area, where the old bulk propane system had been. I ran new electrical lines to the community center's distribution panel, installed a transfer switch so the generator could seamlessly take over during power outages, and set up a fuel management system with 4 propane tanks rotating on a schedule. The work was technically complex, but it was also satisfying. I was solving a real problem with my skills and equipment, and doing it in a way that met all the electrical codes and safety requirements. On Friday evening, I ran a full systems test. I deliberately tripped the main circuit breaker to simulate a power outage, and my generator kicked on within 10 seconds. The community center's lights stayed on, the HVAC system continued running, and the kitchen appliances never lost power. Patricia watched the test with visible relief. This is amazing, Mr. Donovan. How long can you keep this running? As long as I can keep refilling the propane tanks. Each tank gives me about 12 hours of runtime at typical load. I have enough tanks to rotate them through refilling cycles without interruption. And you can maintain this until we get the permanent system repaired, I nodded. 6 weeks should be no problem, maybe longer if needed. The wedding on Saturday went off without a hitch. There wasn't even a power outage, but I stayed on call just in case. Patricia sent me a thank you email that evening, mentioning that the bride's family had specifically commented on how professional everything had been. But my involvement with the community center's power systems had one unexpected consequence. It made me realize how many other backup systems in the neighborhood were probably in similar states of neglect. 2 weeks after I had set up the temporary generator, I was doing routine maintenance on my equipment when Patricia stopped by to check on things. "Everything's running smoothly," I told her. "No issues at all. The propane consumption is actually lower than I estimated because the weather has been mild." "That's good to hear. I've been meaning to ask you something, though. Do you know anything about the emergency lighting systems in the neighborhood?" I looked up from the gauge I was reading. "What emergency lighting systems?" "There are supposed to be emergency lights at all the neighborhood entrances and at the pool area. They're battery-backed systems that should activate during power outages. But during that storm last week, none of them worked." I felt a sinking feeling. "Let me guess. Linda Kozlowski was supposed to be maintaining those too." Patricia nodded grimly. "I've been going through more old records." She had service contracts for all kinds of things. Emergency lighting, the pool pump backup system, even the gate controllers at the main entrance. And I'm starting to suspect that none of it was actually being maintained. How much of this was she doing herself versus hiring legitimate contractors? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Some of the invoices are from real companies, and those systems seem to be working fine. But anything that was supposedly being handled by individual contractors, especially ones like you who lived in the neighborhood, those are all suspect now. Who else's name did she use? Patricia pulled out a folder. At least 4 other residents. There's an invoice for landscaping services under the name of Jennifer Hudson, who actually works as a pediatric nurse and has never done landscaping in her life. There's pool maintenance under Robert Tran's name, and he's a software developer who doesn't even own a pool skimmer. And there are security system checks supposedly done by David Martinez, who turns out to be 78 years old and recovering from hip replacement surgery. I whistled low. This is bigger than I thought. The board is meeting tonight to discuss the full scope. We've hired a forensic accountant to review 5 years of financial records. The preliminary estimate is that Linda stole or misappropriated over $100,000. The scope of Linda Kozlowski's fraud continued to expand as the investigation deepened. The forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Rachel Epstein, discovered that Linda had been running her scheme for nearly 4 years before being caught. She had been clever about it, keeping individual invoices small enough that they didn't trigger any red flags, but numerous enough that they added up to substantial amounts over time. The criminal case against Linda moved through the court system, and I was called as a witness during the preliminary hearings. The courtroom was in downtown Charlotte, in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, and I spent an uncomfortable morning on the witness stand explaining my role in the situation. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Michael Torres, walked me through the timeline. "Mr. Donovan, when did you first become aware that invoices were being submitted in your name?" "When Patricia Zimmer, the current HOA property manager, called me about the backup generator failure at the community center." "And you had never agreed to provide these services?" "No, sir. I had never even seen the propane refill equipment that was supposedly being maintained in my name." "Did you receive any of the payments that were issued?" "No. I've provided my complete banking records to show that none of those checks were deposited into my accounts." Linda's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named James Walsh, tried to suggest that I might have been involved and simply hadn't kept good records. But my documentation was thorough, and Detective Morrison's investigation had clearly shown that Linda had opened a fraudulent bank account to cash the checks. The preliminary hearing resulted in Linda being bound over for trial on multiple felony charges. Her bail was set at $50,000, which she couldn't make, so she remained in custody. While the criminal case proceeded, the HOA was dealing with the practical consequences of Linda's neglect. The emergency lighting systems needed complete replacement. The pool backup pump was damaged beyond repair. The gate controllers were so outdated that parts were no longer available. Patricia approached me 3 weeks into my temporary generator service with another proposal. "Mr. Donovan, the board has been impressed with your work on the community center backup power. We'd like to hire you as a consultant to assess all of our infrastructure systems and develop a proper maintenance plan." I considered the offer. "I'm not looking for a second career in HOA management, Patricia. I understand that, but we need someone with technical expertise who can tell us what's actually needed versus what we're being sold by contractors. The board is willing to pay you $75 an hour for the assessment work." That was a fair rate, and the work sounded interesting. "How many systems are we talking about?" 14 different items. "The backup generator, emergency lighting, pool systems, gate controllers, security cameras, irrigation pumps, and several others. Most of them have been neglected for years. Give me the full list, and I'll put together a proposal for the assessment work." Over the next month, I conducted a comprehensive review of Pleasant Valley Estate's infrastructure. The work was more extensive than I had anticipated. I spent evenings and weekends crawling through equipment rooms, testing systems, and documenting the actual condition of everything. What I found was sobering. Nearly every system that had supposedly been maintained by Linda Kozlowski was in poor condition or completely non-functional. The emergency lighting batteries were dead. The pool backup pump had seized from lack of use. The irrigation system had multiple broken zones that were wasting water, but I also found systems that were working perfectly because they had been maintained by legitimate contractors. The main electrical service was solid. The HVAC systems for the community buildings were in good condition. The security cameras were operational. I compiled my findings into a 60-page report with photographs, technical specifications, and cost estimates for repairs. The total bill for bringing everything up to proper standards was $240,000. The HOA board meeting where I presented my findings was tense. The community room was packed with residents who had heard about the scope of Linda's fraud and wanted answers. Patricia introduced me, and I walked through the report section by section. I tried to be clear and factual without being alarmist, but the numbers spoke for themselves. One resident, an older man named George Brennan, raised his hand during the Q&A. "Mr. Donovan, are you saying we need to spend $250,000 to fix everything?" "Not all at once," I said. "I've prioritized the repairs by safety and critical function. The backup generator for the community center is essential. The emergency lighting is a safety issue. But some of the other items, like the irrigation system improvements, can be done over time as budget allows." Another resident, a woman named Teresa Walsh, stood up. "How do we know you're not inflating these numbers to make more money as a consultant?" It was a fair question, even if it stung a bit. I've based all my cost estimates on quotes from 3 independent contractors for each system. The estimates in my report are actually the middle quotes, not the highest ones, and I'm not bidding on any of the repair work myself. "This is purely an assessment," Patricia added. The board has had Mr. Donovan's report reviewed by an independent engineering firm. They concurred with his findings and said his cost estimates were conservative, if anything. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. There were angry questions about how Linda had gotten away with her fraud for so long. There were concerns about how the repairs would be funded. And there were a few residents who thanked me for stepping in to help when the situation had become critical. The board ultimately voted to move forward with my recommended priority repairs and to establish a reserve fund for infrastructure maintenance. They also voted to implement new financial controls to prevent future fraud, including requiring dual signatures on checks over $1,000 and quarterly audits by an independent accountant. My temporary generator service at the community center lasted for 7 weeks while contractors installed a new permanent backup power system. The new system was completely different from what Linda had supposedly been maintaining. Instead of a propane bulk storage tank that required regular refills, they installed a natural gas generator that connected directly to the utility gas line. It was more expensive upfront, but it required minimal maintenance and would never run out of fuel during an extended outage. When the new system was installed and tested, I removed my portable generator and returned it to my workshop. Patricia insisted on the HOA reimbursing me not just for my time, but also for the propane I had used and the wear on my equipment. The check came to $4,200, which felt appropriate given the effort involved. Linda Kozlowski's trial took place 6 months after her arrest. I was called as a witness again, this time for the full trial. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been for the preliminary hearing, with multiple residents from Pleasant Valley estates attending to watch justice being served. The prosecutor laid out a detailed case showing how Linda had systematically defrauded the HOA over nearly 4 years. She had created fake invoices, forged signatures, opened fraudulent bank accounts, and neglected the actual maintenance duties she was being paid to perform. The total amount stolen exceeded $130,000. Linda's defense was weak. Her attorney argued that she had been under financial stress due to medical bills for her mother's care, but the prosecutor showed that much of the stolen money had gone to vacations, designer clothes, and a luxury car lease. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: theft, fraud, forgery, and identity theft. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, I was given an opportunity to provide a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium and looked at Linda, who sat at the defense table looking diminished and defeated. Linda Kozlowski used my name and reputation to cover up her crimes, I said. She put my credibility at risk and could have seriously damaged my career if this hadn't been uncovered. But more than that, she put an entire community at risk by neglecting critical safety systems. The emergency lighting that didn't work could have led to injuries during a power outage. The backup generator that failed could have caused major problems during an emergency. Her greed and dishonesty created real dangers for real people. Other residents gave similar statements. The board president talked about the financial impact on the HOA and the special assessments that had been required to fund emergency repairs. Patricia described the loss of trust in HOA management and the extra work required to verify every system and contract. The judge listened to it all, then delivered a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Linda Kozlowski was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, with credit for time served. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $130,000 to the Pleasant Valley Estates, HOA. though everyone recognized that she would probably never be able to pay more than a fraction of that amount. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure. The situation had been frustrating and stressful, but it had also brought some unexpected positive outcomes. I had proven my expertise in backup power systems and infrastructure maintenance. I had earned respect from my neighbors and the HOA board, and I had helped ensure that Pleasant Valley estates would be better managed going forward. But the story didn't quite end there. About a month after Linda's sentencing, Patricia called me with one more proposal. "Mr. Donovan, the board has been discussing our ongoing maintenance needs. We've hired a new property management company, and they're much more professional than what we had before. But we still need someone with technical expertise to oversee infrastructure systems." "Patricia, I've already done the assessment work. Everything is documented in my report." "I know, and that report has been invaluable. But we need someone to serve as a technical advisor on an ongoing basis. Review contractor bids, approve major repairs, conduct annual inspections. It would be maybe 10 hours a month, and we'd pay you a retainer." I thought about it. The work wouldn't be particularly time-consuming, and it would give me some influence over how the community was managed. Plus, the retainer would be useful supplemental income. What kind of retainer are we talking about? $1,500 a month. And you'd be an independent contractor, so you'd maintain your autonomy. Let me think about it. I discussed it with Marcus Chen over beers that weekend. He had become a good friend during the whole generator crisis, and I valued his perspective. "You should do it," Marcus said. "The HOA needs someone who actually knows what they're talking about, and it'll prevent another Linda situation from happening. I'm just worried about the time commitment. I already have a full-time job. 10 hours a month isn't bad. That's like 2 or 3 evenings. And you'd be helping everyone in the neighborhood." He was right, of course. I called Patricia the following Monday and accepted the position as technical advisor to the Pleasant Valley Estates, HOA. Over the next year, I helped oversee the implementation of all the priority repairs from my assessment. The emergency lighting was replaced with modern LED systems that had 10-year battery life. The pool backup pump was upgraded to a more reliable system. The gate controllers were replaced with new units that could be monitored remotely. I also helped the board implement better maintenance practices. We established a schedule for regular inspections of every major system. We created a reserve fund specifically for infrastructure repairs, funded by a small monthly increase in HOA dues. And we implemented a contractor vetting process to ensure that anyone working on HOA property was properly licensed and insured. The transformation was remarkable. Within 18 months of Linda Kozlowski's arrest, Pleasant Valley Estates had gone from a community with critically neglected infrastructure to one with well-maintained, modern systems. Property values increased. Resident satisfaction improved. And the community center became a popular venue for events because people knew they could count on it being reliable. My own reputation benefited too. Other HOAs in the Charlotte area heard about what had happened and reached out for consulting help. I started doing infrastructure assessments for 3 other communities, turning it into a legitimate side business. I even created a website and business cards. The work was interesting, the pay was good, and I was helping people avoid the problems that had plagued Pleasant Valley Estates. One evening about 2 years after the original propane tank fine incident, I was doing a routine inspection of the community center's backup generator when Patricia stopped by. "How's everything looking?" she asked. "Perfect," I said, checking the readings on the natural gas meter. This system has been rock solid since installation. No issues at all. I still can't believe how bad things were before. We were one major emergency away from a complete disaster. I nodded. That's the thing about infrastructure. When it's working, nobody notices. But when it fails, everyone suffers. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I've been thinking about that original fine we gave you, the one about the propane tanks. If we hadn't done that, none of this would have been discovered. Linda would have kept stealing, the systems would have kept deteriorating, and eventually something really bad would have happened." "That's a generous way to look at it," I said. "But I'd rather you had just listened when I explained what I was doing instead of assuming I was violating covenants." Fair point. I've learned a lot about not making assumptions and about the importance of actually verifying things instead of just trusting paperwork. We talked for a while longer about upcoming maintenance needs and resident concerns. It was a far cry from our first contentious meeting in her office, when she had been inflexible and I had been defensive. We had both grown from the experience. As I drove home that evening, I passed the entrance to Pleasant Valley Estates with its well-lit signs and smoothly operating gate. The emergency lighting cast a warm glow over the landscaping. The irrigation system kept everything green and healthy. And somewhere in the community center, my friend Marcus was probably setting up for his daughter's birthday party, confident that the lights would stay on and the air conditioning would work. It had been a long journey from that certified letter on a Tuesday afternoon to this point. There had been frustration, anger, criminal investigations, trials, and extensive repair work. But in the end, the community was better for it. Systems that had been neglected for years were now properly maintained. Financial controls prevented future fraud. And residents had a renewed sense of trust in their HOA leadership. I had also learned important lessons about standing up for myself when wrongly accused, about helping my community even when I had reason to be bitter, and about turning a negative situation into an opportunity for positive change. The propane fine that had started everything had been wrong and unfair, but it had exposed a much larger problem that needed to be solved. Sometimes that's how progress happens, through friction and conflict that brings hidden issues to light. As I pulled into my own driveway and saw the workshop where I had built the backup generator that saved the day, I felt satisfied. Not just with how things had turned out, but with the choices I had made along the way. I had maintained my integrity, used my skills to help others, and ultimately made my community a better place to live. And if anyone from the HOA ever tried to fine me for my propane tanks again, well, I had a stack of documentation and a legal precedent that would shut that down real quick. But I didn't think it would be an issue. Patricia and the new board understood the difference between legitimate home maintenance and actual violations. They had learned that lesson the hard way. I walked into my house, grabbed a cold drink from the refrigerator, and settled in for the evening. Outside, the neighborhood hummed along with all its systems working exactly as they should. The lights were on, the generators were ready, and the emergency system stood waiting for that inevitable moment when they would be needed. Everything was as it should be. And I had played a part in making it that way, one propane refill at a time.